On a summer day in 1813, the ground of Vitoria trembled under the weight of history. Armies collided, empires faltered, and a single battle began to rewrite Europe's destiny. This is where the foe truly began. In the heart of Spain, on a warm June morning, the drums of war echoed across the plains of Vitoria. Dust rose into the air as thousands of soldiers prepared for a confrontation that would decide far more than territoriate, would determine the future of an entire empire. The Spanish people had suffered for years. The mountains had seen endless marshes, and Europe watched with breath held tight. By 1813, the war had changed. The tide that once surged in favor of a dominating force had begun to recede, and Vitoria would become the proving ground of that shift. For years, an empire had swept across Europe with the force of a storm, reshaping borders and unraveling kingdoms. But by 1813, the storm had begun to weaken. Its thunder still echoed, yet its power was no longer absolute. The people had grown weary of occupation. What once seemed unstoppable now appeared vulnerable, stretched thin across too many fronts, burdened by greed, exhaustion, and the relentless pressure of a continent refusing to bow. The spark of resistance that ignited in the mountains and villages had grown into a flame, carried by men who refused to surrender their land or their identity. Every skirmish, every rebellion, every silent act of defiance chipped away at the empire's confidence. The Allied forces sensed it. British discipline, Portuguese resolve, and Spanish fury began to merge into a unified purpose. They could feel the shift not merely in strategy, but in spirits. Where once they fought to survive, now they fought to win. As they marched toward Vitoria, they carried with them the weight of every injustice, every shattered home, every cry that echoed through the long years of war. The turning of the tide was no accident. It was born of determination sharpened by suffering. On the other side, uncertainty had begun to seep into the ranks of the imperial army. Soldiers who once marched with certainty now questioned orders whispered through the chain of command. Supplies dwindled, discipline faltered, and the burden of wealth seized from half a continent slowed their steps. What was intended to be the spoils of victory now became the symbols of impending collapse, wagons overflowing with gold, art, and relics, guarded not with pride but with dread. At Vitoria, the landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. Rolling hills stood like silent witnesses to a turning chapter. The wind carried the tension of two worlds, colliding, one fighting to reclaim its freedom, the other struggling to preserve what remained of its fading dominance. The truth would be carved in motion in the thunder of boots crossing valleys, in the rhythmic clatter of artillery wheels dragging across stone, in the synchronized breath of thousands, preparing for a single moment that could alter the fate of Europe. For the Allied forces, this was more than a march. It was the culmination of sacrifice, persistence, and the unbearable weight of years spent resisting a power that once seemed untouchable. They did not advance as scattered armies, but as a single, coordinated force shaped by necessity and sharpened by experience. For immense columns stretched across the landscape, each moving with precision, each knowing that timing would decide everything. To the east, the river shimmered faintly beneath the morning sun, guiding Portuguese units along its banks. They were hardened by countless battles, men who had learned to survive under the harshest conditions, driven by a quiet resolve to reclaim what had been stolen from their homeland. To the west, Spanish troops pressed forward with a fervor that could be felt even before they were seen. They carried not only muskets, but the memories of burned villages, starved families, and the relentless brutality of occupation. Every step they took toward Vitoria was fueled by years of suffering that demanded redemption. Their faces bore the exhaustion of war, yet their eyes carried a fierce determination to drive the invaders from their soil once and for all. And between them, the heart of the Allied advance. Two powerful British columns, marching with the steady, disciplined pace that had become their trademark. These weren't just soldiers. They were professionals, veterans of 100 firefights, led by a commander who understood the art of war better than almost anyone. The man leading them, the Duke of Wellington, understood the weight of the moment, that a victory here was not just a military triumph, but the liberation of a nation drowning in occupation. His plan was a masterpiece of coordination, a complex web of movements designed to trap and crush the enemy. The columns moved through valleys and ridges, a great net closing in on an overstretched imperial army. Across the plain, the defending force under King Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jourdan struggled to form a coherent defense. They were caught off guard. Their army was strung out 4 miles, not ready for a major battle. Worse, they were burdened by a colossal convoy of wagons, packed with the looted treasures of Spain, art, gold, jewelry, official documents. Spoils of a 5-year occupation clogged the main road out of Vitoria. This treasure wasn't just baggage. It was a symbol of their arrogance, and it would become their anchor. It slowed their movements, distracted their commanders, and ultimately sealed their fate. The French command was in disarray. Joseph and Jourdan disagreed on strategy. Their troops were spread too thin, with vast gaps between their defensive lines. They were trying to protect a city, a retreat route, and a fortune all at once. They would succeed at none of them. Muskets were loaded, cannons were aligned, and the tension thickened in the summer air. When the first shots rang out, Vitoria erupted into a storm of fire and steel. The Allied columns hit the French lines from multiple directions at once. The first attack came from the south, where a British division stormed the heights of La Puebla, a key ridge overlooking the battlefield. The fighting was brutal, a desperate struggle for high ground. But the British were relentless. They pushed the French defenders back, securing a critical vantage point. At the same time, other columns were crossing the Zadorra River, crashing into the French center and left flank. Villages became battlegrounds. Stone walls and farmhouses turned into makeshift fortresses. Hills became strongholds, contested with bayonet and cannon. The French fought back bravely in places, but their lines were too fragmented. The Allied pressure was overwhelming, coming from all sides. One by one, defensive lines broke. The Imperial Army, once feared across Europe, found itself pushed back, overwhelmed, and cornered. The sound of retreating drums replaced the thunder of advance. In the center of the battlefield, the fighting surged around the bridges crossing the river. Allied soldiers charged into a hail of musket fire, their redcoats making them easy targets. But they didn't falter. They waded through the water, climbed the banks, and drove the defenders from their positions. The French army began to unravel. By afternoon, the battle was no longer a contested, it was a collapse. The French center broke completely. The retreat turned into a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives, trying to escape the closing Allied trap. The main road to France was blocked by the massive, slow-moving convoy of treasure. The escape route was a bottleneck of chaos. Wagons overturned. Horses panicked. Soldiers, officers, and civilians scrambled to save themselves, abandoning everything else. King Joseph himself barely escaped, forced to leave his carriage behind and flee on horseback. The treasure-laden convoy, the symbol of years of dominance, was abandoned. The Allied soldiers, seeing the riches for the taking, broke ranks. A frenzy of looting began. The discipline that had won the battle momentarily dissolved as men scrambled to grab gold coins, silverware, and priceless paintings. It was perhaps the largest single haul of booty in modern military history. Wellington, furious at the breakdown of order, called it the scum of the earth who had come to plunder. But the looting couldn't change the outcome. The French army in Spain was shattered. Vitoria did more than defeat an army. It broke an aura of invincibility. The loss was catastrophic. The French lost nearly all of their artillery, their entire baggage train, and the war chest meant to fund their campaign. More importantly, they lost their grip on Spain forever. The news of the victory spread like wildfire across Europe. It gave new hope to the coalition forming against Napoleon. Austria, which had been hesitating, was emboldened to declare war. The German states saw that the emperor was not unbeatable. Vitoria was a nail in the coffin of the Peninsular War and a major turning point in the Napoleonic Wars as a whole. From that day, the decline accelerated. What was lost at Vitoria was not simply ground or treasure, it was the illusion of an unbreakable empire. The battle was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of a united front, and the fatal flaw of arrogance. The tide had not just turned, it had become a flood, sweeping away the foundations of an empire built on conquest. And from the ashes of that chaotic battlefield, littered with abandoned cannons and scattered gold, the end began to take shape. The road from Vitoria led inexorably to Paris, and to the final downfall of one of history's greatest conquerors. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. See you next time. Through the smoke and chaos, the disciplined ranks of the British marched, steady and unwavering. They were the spine of the Allied advance, their red coats a river of purpose flowing across the scarred landscape. These soldiers were veterans, forged in the fires of defeat and retreat. They knew the cost of hesitation and the grim patience required to strike at the perfect moment. Under the weight of their heavy packs, they pressed onward with a calm ferocity, their eyes fixed on the monumental task ahead. This alliance wasn't built on chance. Every movement was a calculated stroke in a grand design. Hills were chosen to shield their approach, valleys to funnel their strength. The small villages scattered across the plains became stepping stones, and even the rivers served a purpose, acting as both guide and barrier. It was a strategy of instinct, born from years of fighting on this very terrain. Across the field, the defenders struggled. Their numbers were vast, but they were scattered, stretched thin, and disorganized. Commanders shouted hurried orders, trying to piece together a cohesive line where only chaos remained. Behind them, the roads were choked with wagons, overflowing with the spoils of a battered continent. This plundered wealth, meant to be a symbol of triumph, now slowed their retreat and shattered their cohesion. A dead weight on a crumbling army. The battlefield became a living map of intention versus chaos. Gray streams of smoke rose from distant skirmishes, signaling the first clashes where outposts buckled under pressure. The ground trembled as cavalry maneuvered into position, preparing for the decisive charge that could either break an enemy line or shatter upon it. From ridge to ridge, observers watched in tense silence, trying to guess where the final blow would fall. And through it all, the Allies closed in like tightening jaws. Their strategy was not the push from one direction, but from all at once. They aimed to suffocate the defenders, overwhelm their weakened structure, and force a total collapse. Every soldier, from the highest commander to the youngest drummer boy, understood. This was no ordinary battle. This was the day the tide wouldn't just turn, it would crash. The crash came not in a single moment, but in a series of fractures that spread across the battlefield like cracks in a weakening wall. As the Allied columns pressed inward, the defending lines bent, buckled, and then broke. Muskets flashed through the drifting smoke. Cannons thundered from distant ridges, and the air filled with the roaring echo of a struggle too vast for any one person to comprehend. The empire that had once dominated Europe was now fighting for its very survival. Villages became impromptu fortresses. Stone farmhouses, once home to quiet lives, were now strong points, where soldiers clung to their positions with grim resolve. Streets turned into corridors of gunfire. Fields where wheat once swayed now shook under the weight of thunderous cavalry charges. Everywhere the defenders looked, they saw the relentless advance of disciplined ranks. The Allied plan unfolded with unnerving precision. While one column pinned the defenders with a frontal assault, another swept around the southern flank, striking where they were least expected. The sound of musket volleys rolled across the hills like waves breaking against a shore. Confusion turned to panic. Orders collided, and the defenders struggled to see where the next blow would land. Retreat began in whispers. Small groups pulled back from untenable positions, officers shouting commands that were swallowed by the noise of battle. What started as a controlled withdrawal quickly degenerated into a desperate scramble. The roads became a tangled mess of soldiers, artillery, and that massive convoy of wagons, the heavy shadow of a looting empire. These wagons, laden with treasures, became fatal obstacles. Every wheel that sank into the mud, every cart that toppled, trapped more men behind it. The Allies sensed the unraveling and pushed harder. British infantry stormed from ridge to ridge, driving deeper into the crumbling center. Spanish forces surged with renewed fury, reclaiming ground soaked with years of their own suffering. Portuguese regiments advanced with unwavering steadiness, methodically cutting off escape routes. Each thrust drove the defenders further into disarray, reducing once proud battalions into scattered, fleeing fragments. By midday, pockets of resistance still burned fiercely. On the outskirts of Vitoria, rearguard units fought desperately, trying to buy a few precious moments for the rest to escape. Cannon fire shook the earth, and thick smoke turned the sun into a dim, flickering ember. But the Allies pressed on, their momentum fueled by the scent of a victory that was now inevitable. Panic rippled through the defending ranks as the weight of their fate settled upon them. Officers waved their swords, trying to direct men who were deafened by the roar and blinded by the smoke. Some units fought on stubbornly, refusing to give ground. Others simply dissolved, crushed by fear and exhaustion. The unity that had once defined the Empire's armies fractured into 1,000 pieces of confusion. The final collapse became undeniable when the great convoy stalled. Dozens of wagons tangled in a mass of timber, horses, and panicked men on the narrow road leading out of Vitoria. Treasure gold, jewels, priceless art spilled onto the dirt as soldiers abandoned their loads to save their lives. What had once symbolized power now marked the Empire's ultimate humiliation. The Allies poured forward, seizing the moment. The defenders, trapped between the advancing armies and their own stolen riches, could no longer hold any line. As the afternoon wore on, the retreat turned into a full-blown flight. The distant hills filled with stragglers, casting fearful glances over their shoulders as the victorious cheers of the Allies surged behind them. The advance reached the heart of the plain, claiming abandoned guns, shattered formations, and the ruins of a legacy that was crumbling before the world's eyes. The Battle of Vitoria didn't end with a final, glorious charge. It ended with the slow, undeniable realization that an ERA had fractured. What was lost here was not just control of Spain, but the illusion of invincibility that had shielded an empire for so long. The defeat echoed far beyond the battlefield, sending shockwaves through the courts and kingdoms of Europe. The power that had dominated a continent was now vulnerable, mortal, and nearing its final reckoning. The fields of Vitoria, once unremarkable, had become the stage where the spell of dominance was finally broken. What began as a coordinated advance ended in a decisive unraveling, exposing the frailty behind an empire that had seemed unshakable. For the Allies, it was vindication. The suffering, the sacrifice, it all found meaning in this moment of triumph. For the empire in retreat, it was the beginning of an irreversible descent. The treasure left scattered on the roads of Spain stood as a stark reminder that no power, no matter how vast, escapes the consequences of its own overreach. In the quiet that followed the chaos, the world understood that the balance of power had shifted forever. The road ahead would lead to more battles and greater struggles, but Vitoria was the turning point. It was the moment where resolve defeated dominance, where unity overcame fear, and where an empire first heard the unmistakable sound of its own decline. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of history's great turning points compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more. We'll see you next time.